for being so patient. Welcome to the Strand. We are we're 85 years old and still independent. I am Jessica Strand, the events director here, and I am no relation to the Bass family that owns the bookstore. And I didn't change my name for the job. It is complete coincidence. Anyway, tonight's discussion will focus on the failings of our American system, from joblessness to our distrust of those in power to inequality. Writer and documentary filmmaker D.W. Gibson, who recently finished his book and documentary entitled Not Working, People Talk About Losing a Job and Finding Their Way in Today's Changing Economy, will talk candidly with the nation's editor-at-large and TV political commentator Chris Hayes, who also has recently published his book, Twilight of the Elites. The two will be joined by social commentator Rich Benjamin, author of Searching for Whitopia, an improbable journey to the heart of white America. The three will talk about the issues at hand, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. And please join me in welcoming D.W. Gibson, Chris Hayes, and Rich Benjamin. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Rich Benjamin. Thank you for coming. We're delighted to see you. Fall in New York is always crackling. There's a million things to do. And so I'm grateful you've chosen to be here with us. Besides Jessica Strand's introduction of these two, I just want to supplement that introduction with a couple of things. D.W. Gibson runs a writers' colony called Letic House, and he runs another international writers' colony called Sangham House. And it's a privilege to have him here because within literary circles in the literary community, he's known as just such a dear person who's really extended himself to helping people all the way from Tbilisi to the Congo. And I'm talking about journalists who are in deep and immediate distress. Just someone you can rely on. And I'm glad to have Chris here too. A bit of trivia is that Chris's show, Up with Chris Hayes, averages #1 for its Sunday time slot among viewers 18 to 34. And that shouldn't surprise anyone, given that I think that generation, that demographic, becomes utterly tired and bored with the nonsensical fight that we see on cable news. And I've had the privilege of being on his show a couple times, and he's just a live wire. He just brings such a thoughtful, wonderful confrontation to the issues with no BS. And, you know, it's very different than what we see on Fox. So I'm glad that Chris is here. And the final thing I'll say is I feel like these two are honorary Jamaicans because they are the hardest working people. They have multiple gigs. Besides DW's 2 gigs I mentioned, running writers' colonies, he's also a documentary film maker, and we're going to see a taste of his film. And his Florentine Films, Ken Burns' documentary outfit, which is producing the film. But Chris Hayes, talking about juggling gigs and just being, you know, a hard-working person, is also an editor-at-large at The Nation and a writer, in addition to hosting his show. So I'm just delighted to have them here for this discussion on their completely timely books. I'd like to say a word about Demos, which is co-hosting this evening. Demos is a nonpartisan research and advocacy institute concerned with having a more equitable democracy and a more equitable economy. And we do that through 4 main ways. One is through upward mobility, i.e. expanding the middle class. Another one is through achieving ideal elections, making our electoral process more fair. Another is by reducing the influence of money in politics. And the final is redefining the role of business. And so I just want to thank my Demos colleagues who help make this event possible and just make working there every day just delightful. So let's begin with you, DW. What are you going to show us?
I'm going to show you guys just a few minutes of the documentary. So I guess I'll provide bigger context before doing that, just so you all know about not working. In the summer of 2011 and the fall of 2011, I traveled across the country with a few compadres to collect interviews with folks that have lost their jobs somewhere between 2007 and 2011, that 5-year period. We drove from Orange County, California to New York. And we stopped along the way engaging people in churches and soup kitchens and unemployment offices and talking to local beat reporters and friends of friends on Facebook to find people that had lost their job and were willing to tell me their story. And the conversations really hinged on that moment when they received the news, when and how they were told that they no longer had a job, and the conversation sort of fanned out from there. I talked to people from various professions and pay brackets and backgrounds and parts of the country, so it's really quite a spectrum. And it was quite a hustle too. It was sort of the art of being in Reno and looking for people to talk to us in 3 days in Salt Lake City, being in Salt Lake City, looking for people to talk to us in a few days in Omaha. It was only after we finished the project that I kind of realized the audacity of the request, just sitting down with a perfect stranger and talking to me for a couple of hours about a really terrible event they might like to forget. So I'm in deep gratitude to everyone who gave of their time and their story. The book really came about when talking to a good friend of mine, Colin Robinson, who told me the story of how he lost his job in publishing on a day known as Black Wednesday in publishing, when hundreds of people were laid off in one day. And, it had all the familiar beats. He had to pack a box. He had to go into the boss's office. But it was all the nuance. It was the fact that he couldn't take the box with him. Security had to vet it before he could take it with him, and they were going to ship it to him, after they approved all of the staplers and tape and gum and all that stuff. The fact that he ended up comforting his boss who was delivering the news, having a hard time giving him the news. Those touches and the experience that Colin had sort of expressing this story, once he was done, we realized there was an opportunity there to practice that on a bigger scale. If it had accomplished nothing else, it would accomplish a sense of community and maybe address the isolation that a lot of people feel throughout the experience. It was that coupled with a deep love that Colin and I both have for Studs Terkel. If you do not know who Studs Terkel is, please go discover him. He wrote a book called Working, which I am obviously riffing on, in the 1970s, and he went around talking to people about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. And we're a country with a lot of folks that don't have anything to do, so I spoke to them about that. I talked to over 200 people. And about 50 of them, we were able to talk to them on camera if they felt comfortable. So we've just finished editing a 90-minute feature. And that will come out into the world very soon. And I'm going to show you just the first 4 minutes and 32 seconds or something like that. Just the introductory moment so you can get a feel for it. It's actually not the final cut, but it's very close to it. Yeah, so I will show you that. We'll dim the lights and we'll go from there. So we need to switch to the sound on the shooter.
So this is where I spent 11 months in this building over here as a quote-unquote loan officer. Although I didn't really have much formal training, I was still just doing telemarketing essentially. And it was at the tail end of the heyday of subprime mortgages, I guess. It was right when things were sort of starting to go downhill, and they didn't really have much structure in the office anymore or anything. Didn't send me off for training, didn't do any of the stuff they would normally do. And one day, my boss, Wanda, she said, we should go outside for a cigarette. She pulled me out right underneath this tree and told me she was letting me go. She's kept apologizing over and over again. I was, you know, smart enough to know, I guess, that it wasn't her decision. It was just, you know, what had to be done. I sensed it the whole time. I was basically just riding it anyways, making $2,500 a month, so it was bound to come to an end eventually. I didn't really have anything there to collect, so I didn't collect it and just got my little geometry and geofilm. That was my day. I had just moved into an apartment, moved in with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. So I had to break that news and go on unemployment again, and so that was that. She got laid off just right after that too, so we both, you know, were jobless for a little while.
I remember my heart just racing because I knew something wasn't right.
I was working in an office, my desk, and he came in there and sat across the desk from me.
The division that you're in, we are dissolving.
Staff probably took it harder than I did. There was a lot of crying. There was a lot of tears, and I was comforting them, you know.
That little number that you see on, you know, column A, row 7 is an actual person with a wife, with a kid, with a car payment, with a mortgage, and is actually from your country, from your neighborhood, and is a viable person in the community.
When I grew up, my dad was a shoe salesman for Bostonian shoes, and he was transferred all over the country. I went to a different school every year, and my dream always was, I don't want to move anymore. I want to get married, I want to have a couple kids, I want to have a house that I never move out of, and go to work at a company where I can retire. So there's the dream. And 31 years later, the dream is no more.
I'm doing everything that I'm told to do, and I'm trained to do, but yet, for whatever reason, it's not happening.
If you're weak-minded and you feel like God put you here for a reason, this is who you are. He put me here to see how strong I am, I think. I'm gonna show you I'm strong.
What most people don't understand is this is not your typical recession. You know, there's an old joke people say, I think it came from Harry Truman, that a recession is when your neighbor loses his job and a depression is when you lose yours. But the fact that we did something about it a few years ago, the fact that the Fed acted, even though there was limited amounts they could do, the fact that the Obama administration and the Bush administration before that intervened is what kept us from becoming like a Great Depression. But it's still a depression.
So anyway, those are the first few minutes of it. Thanks. I've been working with a friend on this project, a friend I've had since high school. Actually, we met because I gave him my paper route when we were 12. And it's been a long, trying road editing this, but we knew that if we survived a summer in an unair-conditioned Jeep, we could survive anything. The first voice you heard in this movie passed James Morrison, and that's actually his name. The first gentleman you saw, his name is James Morrison. The voice you heard after that was one of Reva Weinstein. And she is here with us this evening, and she's actually going to read a slightly truncated version of her chapter. You know, I spoke to Reva early in this project. She lives here in New York, and she was very gracious to let me talk to her a couple of times, especially early on when I was being particularly sort of clumsy about trying to figure out how I was going to approach this whole thing. And I think that Reva's story is important in many ways, but chiefly two ways. One, she's someone who demonstrates the ability to find positive threads in a very negative situation. and has in many ways reinvented herself by going back to art school and becoming more engaged with her visual art after a long career in advertising. But also, she speaks so very well about that sense of vulnerability that a lot of people try to communicate. And I think that those are two very important facets of her voice in the book. So Reva, I think we can get you set up here on the podium. Is that good? Or do you just want to, do you prefer the podium or any preference? Let's get you at the podium. We'll get you at the podium. Everybody give Reva a hand, would you please?
So this whole thing though?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So this is yes or no? Oh, I see. Better? Yeah. Great. I had no idea really that anything was coming down the pike. And I was actually really grateful to have a job and feeling very lucky I had one. I was in my office and it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, and I got a phone call from the person who was the creative manager. And we had a really nice relationship, but really didn't have a lot to do with each other on a daily basis other than saying hello. So it was really odd for her to call me. When she asked me to come into her office, I remember my heart just racing because I knew something wasn't right. And as I walked into her office, I kind of boisterously sprung into the room saying, "What, are you going to fire me?" And sure enough, she was sitting there with my boss, and they were very apologetically responding to me and saying, "Well, it's not firing exactly, it's not really that. I had been a real asset to the team, and it was very unfortunate. They made a really big deal of the fact that they were letting me go that week, because if they did, I would get this ARRA benefit. The government was subsidizing your health care, which obviously made a huge difference over the course of a year. So I guess they were trying to do the right thing. I was leaving on vacation for 3 days. In the status meeting that morning, I happened to mention that I was going to be leaving the next day for like 3 days. I just reminded them that I wouldn't be there. So I realized in retrospect, after being called in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to the office, that I'd sent them into a tizzy because they were probably planning on letting me go on Friday, which is the day that all good people get let go. They had to pull it together on Tuesday in a matter of hours, so I'm sure there was a lot of running around. I do remember them sort of whisking me downstairs to this exit interview where someone I'd never met before outlined all the details of the non-compete and confidentiality and all these other things. And I remember sitting there and saying to them, "Do we really need to go over this right now? Like, could you give me the papers and let me sit with it? And I'll get back to you when I get back from this little vacation you've ruined for me?" But of course, no, it all had to be signed right then and there. You basically can't leave the building without having signed everything. I remember, aside from the fact that I didn't know this man and had never met him before, he was trying very hard to be compassionate, but it felt so unauthentic, it felt so packaged. And you know, in retrospect, whether it was or not, I don't know. Obviously, this was his job, so there was a certain amount of rehearsal to it. I guess maybe you want a sweet little old grandmother to tell you all these details, I don't know. I went back up to my office and really didn't know what to do with myself. You know, people give you a hug, what can they say? They're just thinking, oh God, not me, you know? And then of course, slowly, a couple of people wandered in, and the guy who I considered to have gotten me the job was just so sweet, and he said, "You're a great writer, it has nothing to do with you." He gave me a great big, a big bear hug, and then joked about, "Do you want the bottle of wine?" I had bought him a really nice bottle of wine when I got the job. So he said, "Do you want the wine back?" Which was great. I mean, you need a moment of levity. You really need a moment like that. I guess a lot of people would storm out, but that's just not me. I was sort of hell-bent on collecting all my stuff and using that time to process it. I guess I needed to process it. I didn't know what to do with myself. I kept packing the stuff up. Finally, the creative manager came in and said, "I think you should go home." You know, she was really nice, and I was really worried about, I guess, because you certainly see how people get locked down and shut out quickly. I think I'm sure I was just depressed. I remember feeling quieter than normal. It chokes me up now to think about it. Even a year later, it still hurts. It's like, I think it's really human. One of the interesting things about the whole process for me is that, of course, it creates a certain kind of vulnerability. I think anybody who gets fired experiences that. I knew that fighting it was not really going to help any. I went through being laid off once before and spent a number of years sort of fighting it, bull in a china shop. So I think it opened up for me this understanding that there was something to be said for being vulnerable and open. And I think it also has a little bit to do with age. Obviously, we hopefully get a little wiser. But there was a certain kind of vulnerability, and it's helped me to learn how to ask for help a little bit more. I'd seen so many people throughout the course of the year or two before also losing their jobs, and people getting really desperate in a way that was striking to me, sort of calling out for help to get jobs and stuff like that. And I guess something in me clicked too, that there's nothing wrong with that, that's actually what you have to do. I mean, sometimes you have to be a little desperate for people to pay attention. And I'm definitely a very independent person, and I'm always like, I take care of myself and stuff like that. And maybe this is age too, is realizing that it just doesn't always serve me. When you take care of yourself really well, nobody really offers to help you either, because they just figure you've got it all down pat and you don't need any help. So it's even more important to ask for it, because nobody realizes you need it. And I think that's certainly been true of me. One of the things that happened in the course of having been laid off or fired or whatever you want to call it, a lot of stuff comes up. And one day I was sitting on the porch, and I remember I was blogging that I had more time on my hands, that I was not working, I was living. And I was sitting on the porch, and I opened the mail, and you know these silly Social Security statements you get of how much money you've paid in and how much money you'll get and all this other stuff? It really struck me because my now husband, then partner, and I had been together for 20 plus years, and it suddenly occurred to me in this moment of vulnerability that actually we wouldn't be benefiting from one another's Social Security payments, despite the fact that we were probably common law, husband and wife, whatever. And so that created this other aha moment in this vulnerability of realizing that we could actually take better care of each other as we got older if we were married, because there was no reason for us to be married until then. We didn't have any kids, there was no sort of upside to it. And that little aha moment started this conversation that we had for, I don't know if it was weeks or months, but we went back and forth because over the years, one of us would want to, the other wouldn't. It was always back and forth, but it was not a big deal. And it really started this conversation. At the end of the day, we ended up getting married and having a beautiful wedding in Hawaii. I've been out of work for over a year now, and it's kind of gone up and down. Obviously, I mean, that's life too, right? I look for work every week to varying degrees of intensity, but I've always also explored what it feels like to not be working. Sometimes panic strikes. I have to say, the last 2 weeks, for some reason, I felt really panic-stricken. But it's interesting, because it's almost like I get more panicked when I actually have interviews. Like I had an interview last week, and somehow that process put me in this really stressed out situation more than not working. Out there interviewing, it's really odd. You know, it's odd to be interviewed by 20-somethings. I've now had 2 situations where I've been in interviews where the person I've interviewed with has literally thrown my resume across the table in like a very offhanded, I don't even know what they were thinking. It's not a very respectful way to treat someone, no matter what their age. And yet that's the kind of environment you go into. In this time period, it's such a buyer's market that I think when you're out there interviewing, people feel perfectly okay with treating you any way they'd like. And I have to tell you, they're not very nice. It's really amazing. They're not courteous, and it's kind of shocking, really. Thank you.
You're done. Okay. So what I'd like to do is begin a free-for-all conversation. But first, let's sort of interrogate Chris Hayes and see what he's written about. And I want to take Reva's beautiful reading and read a brief passage from D.W. Gibson's Not Working as a transition to talk to the elites. and it is about resumes. Who has never circulated a resume? Resumes are at the bottom of stacks, deleted from inboxes, and tossed across tables in half-hearted interviews. It's a buyer's market. Don't try getting anyone on the phone. Human contact is diminished. Filing for unemployment online, I thought there was an office you went to. They didn't even do unemployment offices anymore. Eradicating, therefore, human resources departments, ending employment by way of an emailed attachment. Proximity is minimized or avoided altogether. People are rarely told they are losing their job by the individual who made the decision. The decision comes from someone over there in a corporate building 2 states or 3 continents away. It was sort of like the thing out there in the universe that had done this to me. Capitalism not only prefers its labor to come without face or name, but also that it be cheap. As one ex-banker pointed out to me, Jack Welch once floated the idea of building a giant factory on a giant ship so it could be docked around the world, wherever the wages were the lowest. The quest for cheap labor will travel to the furthest reaches of the world and circle back around again when the opportunity presents itself. So we have this beautiful image of Jack Welch putting labor on a boat. And so that's a transition to talk about Chris Hayes' Twilight of the Elites. So Chris, just tell us about the book, and if we could leave with a couple of the big arguments, what would they be?
I think the one that's most germane to this conversation is arguing about a concept that I call social distance in the book. Social distance is just the basic idea that one of the costs of rising inequality is that you produce a group of elites that are increasingly removed from the lived reality of the majority of the population. And this is something that keeps scaling up and up and up. And there's all sorts of different ways to think about that. One way I mentioned in the book is just to think about the AIDS crisis. I just saw this amazing documentary, How to Survive a Plague, which I would recommend to anyone, about ACT UP, right? And the problem ACT UP faced was a problem of social distance. The people in their world were being killed. They were going through what felt like a Holocaust, and the people who were making decisions were completely unscathed. And the job of ACT UP was to get rid of the distance between the people who were dying and the people who were making decisions that were leading them to die. And increasingly, the unemployment crisis looks like that. The unemployment crisis, I think, in the first panicked days, use the word panic, in the first panicked days of the crisis after Lehman Brothers in that January and February, felt proximate, I think, to even the people in the upper echelons of American life. And there was a tremendous amount of motivation and will to do something about it. And then what started happening around 2010, 2011 was, despite the fact unemployment remained incredibly elevated, we started to see it disappear from the national conversation. And I think there's 2 reasons that happened, and they both have to do with social distance. Unemployment for people with 4-year college degrees went down to about 4.5%, which is what it is right now. It's over 12% with people who have high school degrees. And the Washington, D.C. metro area became the boomingest geographical region in the country. And so if you were a typical Hill staffer, you could read all the charts that you wanted to see, and you knew at some level what the data was. But your lived experience was all of your friends getting hired and a new restaurant opening up a block away from your apartment in a gentrifying neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And one of the contentions of the book is that kind of subliminal information people receive, the lived reality of a society, matters more than whatever charts and graphs you put in their face in a meeting. And I think the kind of cultural shift that happened in the country around the conversation around jobs, the way that it ebbed and we got this big deficit conversation, is entirely a product of the remove of the elites. That we've had a recovery increasingly that is really bifurcated. We have extremely elevated levels of unemployment and long-term unemployment, and yet in some ways it's a capitalist paradise. There's record corporate profits, the Dow has hit all-time highs, and there's this constant huge supply of excess wage labor which depresses worker demands and wages.
So, Chris, let me backstep a little bit. People have been writing about elites for a long time, from C. Stuart Mills on. Tell us, profile the elites for us, and tell us about your definition of the elites.
So I think in current American context, the word elite is an extremely contested one, and it's been appropriated in all sorts of perverse ways. So the most common invocation of the elite happens on the American right by people like Sarah Palin, and it's meant to designate a group of people that are distinguished not by their power or money, but by some host of cultural affectations, set of preferences and tastes. So people who live in certain areas like San Francisco or New York City and drive hybrid cars or drink lattes or white wine, or, in the words of Jeffrey Nunberg, who's a linguist, have seditious taste in cheese and beverages. and that's been appropriated quite effectively to create this picture of what elites are that is a real departure from the traditional understanding of the word, that is an understanding of the word that has been quite consistent through left and right commentators and writers through the years. In fact, there's a whole variety of elite theorists I cite in the book in the 1920s and 30s who are pro-elite, kind of crypto-fascist right-wing writers, who they all agree on what elites are. Elites are a relatively small group of people that exert a disproportionate influence over society's direction. It's not, so Warren Buffett, it doesn't matter that he drives a beat-up Oldsmobile and likes cheeseburgers. We all understand that he is an elite. He's one of the most powerful people probably in the country or the world. And someone who's a kid in the Bronx who happens to like ballet or an NPR, but who, is on food stamps, is not an elite. So it's important to kind of reclaim the core original meaning, historical meaning of the word elite. What I think distinguishes our elites now, and I can go into it further later, but is basically the system that forms them and produces them, which is a system that we call the meritocracy, a system of interlocking institutions and a kind of ideological vision for how elites are selected and formed, that's risen up in the last 40 years and creates some very distinct pathologies.
Okay, let's concretize this. I'm going to throw you some names, and then you tell me how they fit into that description of the elite you just described. So I'll give you three. Ben Bernanke.
Yes.
Bud Selick, who was head of Major League Baseball, and Condi Rice. Let's start there.
So these are all examples of people that I think all count as elites. I mean, Ben Bernanke's arguably one of the most powerful people in the world. Bud Selig is commissioner of Major League Baseball, former owner, a very wealthy man. And Condoleezza Rice, obviously also very powerful. All three of them are people who are products of what we call the meritocracy. These are people who were not born into great wealth. They are not George W. Bush, right? They are people who became elite through this kind of vision we have of the glory of American social mobility. Ben Bernanke's father was a tailor, I believe, even better is Lloyd Blankfein, who grew up in a housing project to become head of Goldman Sachs. So all of them have attained elite status through this process of formation in which people, through a variety of reasons, end up in largely starting with educational institutions, but sometimes in the private sector and business institutions, whose explicit self-mythology is the ability to select out and find the brightest, most industrious minds from any background, and then through this process of competition, select them down and funnel till you have this distilled essence of the smartest, most talented people. And this produces these kinds of pathologies in the people that it selects for. One of these pathologies is this hyper-competitive drive, which is inculcated very early on, in which if you are always looking up the ladder to the next rung, it's very difficult to find the empathy to look below. And this is very subtly produced, I think, in the current meritocratic rat race. Another aspect of this is this, what I call in the book, a cult of smartness, which is this smartness becomes the defining feature, the signature virtue of the meritocracy. Everything else is subordinate to it. as opposed to being one of a host of features that one might want in someone, along with, say, curiosity, empathy, wisdom, judgment, good sense, things like that. Ben Bernanke is someone who is clearly very smart in any sense of academically brilliant, very well regarded, but also has exhibited truly terrible judgment. Yeah. I mean, I can quote chapter verse in the book of him time and time. There is no housing crisis. Subprime is not a problem. Subprime is contained. Subprime is not so contained. Subprime is actually bringing down the entire world economy. And so we have designed a system where we have produced a set of elites who have a set of self-justifying stories they tell about how they got there and why they belong there, that are deeply in tension with any kind of ethos of empathy and compassion, and also any sort of basic mechanisms of accountability that are the necessary feature of forcing people to exhibit empathy.
It reminds me of the book called The Quants. Has anyone read that book, The Quants? Which just basically talks about hyper smart people who went to screw over Wall Street basically by treating it as a casino, who got where they are very, very quantitative methods. So let's go to inequality. And you started to mention one of your concepts, you mentioned fractal inequality. With the indictment of the meritocracy you just gave, why are we left with such inequality, therefore? And then, DW, I want to ask you about how examples and versions of inequality you found in your journey.
I think there's meritocracy ends up acting as the foundational shared mythology by which we justify inequality. We essentially say that we will not bar entrance into the ranks of the American elite based on contingent features such as race, gender, creed, ethnicity, geography. Mormons, lesbians, black people, you can all join the great American elite. We will provide equality of opportunity, which is of course preposterous. We don't provide equality of opportunity, but this is the sort of foundational conceit. And then we won't worry about inequality of outcomes, right? We'll just worry about inequality of accountability, inequality of opportunity. Now, we have a national conversation about providing inequality of opportunity. The single pillar of which is somehow if we break the teachers' unions, then if we can get them, then that 4-year-old child who is going to show up at her first day of school in the South Bronx will have truly equal opportunity with the 4-year-old child showing up for her first day at PS6 on the Upper East Side. And that's a preposterous notion.
Yeah.
But what it does is it is a way of creating a justificatory mythology around desert. And I think one of the things that comes through in the testimonies and here in the interviews is how much that messes with people. Because the flip side of that is if I lost my job, then it must be my fault. It's the flip side of this sort of bizarre Calvinist logic of if I'm Mitt Romney and I am successful, I am therefore deserving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, DW, examples and thoughts on inequality traveling the country.
I love the Calvinist reference. That's true. It's like the inverse of that. The first thing that popped to my mind was a conversation with a gentleman named Manuel in Fresno in his 50s. He came to this country from Durango, Mexico with his family as a young boy to pick grapes in vineyards. And his father brought them to the country so that they could get an education. And what that meant was finishing high school. Manuel talked about he had no clue about the possibility of college. It wasn't even in his capacity of thinking. And he, after high school, didn't know what to do with himself and joined the Army. And it was only after a career, several years in the Army, that he ran into a couple of guys, and the name of his chapter is actually "Then I Met the White Guys," because he met a couple of fellow soldiers who actually, in a rare display of empathy that I think is sort of an exception to this trend that you're talking about, or this parameter that you're talking about, invited him to come along for night classes at a junior college. And he was sort of like, what the hell is this? So he went on to complete junior college and received 2 masters. But I think it's that jumped out of my mind as the fact that shouldn't be an exception, but is an exception, and one that demonstrates someone who doesn't have the doors open to them.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, I want to go back. Part of what we've seen in the opening clips of DW's film and through Reva's reading is the thoughts and consequences of this economy on us. But talk about how, and I was fascinated by this theory, talk about how these phenomena in your mind are backfiring on elites. And you give this beautiful quote with Desmond Tutu saying how apartheid ravaged elites in South Africa. But what's the case here?
Yeah, the case I'm making in the book is, so I think there's a moral or philosophical or political argument to be made about the negative consequences with inequality that revolve around its unjustness. It is simply not fair to have a society that looks the way ours does in terms of the skewedness of its distribution, a society in which 25% of Americans right now, as we sit here in this room, 25% of American households, not Americans, American households, 25 American households make less than $25,000 a year. 1 out of 4. And while, we have people that make billions of dollars a year. So that's the standard, I think, egalitarian critique of inequality, and it's one that obviously I share with every fiber of my being. But the argument I'm making in the book is actually in some ways kind of a practical argument about the fact that one of the most negative consequences of inequality is that it makes for a worse caliber of elite. That the more elitist American society gets, the worse the caliber of elites it produces. And I quote Desmond Tutu talking about the fact that obviously apartheid was horrific subjugation and oppression for the black majority, but it was massively distorting for the ruling white class as well. And this is true, I think, of all forms of repression, all forms of hierarchy at a certain level. If they become extreme enough, they disfigure the people that lord over that hierarchy. It's an insight that goes back to Hegel's writing on the master-slave relationship.
Right.
And one of the consequences we have now, when you look at the financial crisis, the financial crisis is if you concentrate a tremendous amount of power in a small group of people who don't have accountability, who believe that they are the smartest people in the world, who don't have access to cognitive feedback about the consequences of their decisions, right? So you take people who are manipulating these portfolios of mortgages that are ravaging the lives of people who have subprime loans in working class neighborhoods in Raleigh, and are circling around and selling them to pension funds of Norwegian villages. And they are totally untethered from any kind of perceptual cognitive feedback about the consequences of those actions. You will create the conditions for massive catastrophe and crisis. It's inevitable.
He's reminding, who's seen Margin Call, the movie Margin Call? Okay, so this is reminding me of Jeremy Irons' character. He just swoops into a helicopter, has no clue what's going on in the ground, and swoops out, swoops in. He's like the seagull. He shits and leaves and swoops in. And this is corruptive not only to the economy, but to his very capability of running his firm. And so he's the sort of personification of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. One of the things that's fascinating in the book, which I want you to talk about, is that line about it's never the person who made the decision who is doing the firing. And I think that's key for a number of reasons, because if it were, there would be less firing.
Totally, yeah.
Right? Like that actually is playing a really important role in a whole bunch of different ways.
That's a huge thing. When you were talking about social distance, and it's illustrated, the people who finagle that deal between the folks that have mortgages in Raleigh and the pensioners in Norway, they don't know either of those parties, clearly. The most lucid example, I think, is DeWitt, Nebraska, a town of 572 people. In 1924, a guy named Phil Peterson patented the vice grip tool there. And they have a factory there, and everybody in town worked at the factory. They made the vice grip locking pliers.
Had a vice grip on the town's economy.
Exactly. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I talked to Randy Badman, who worked there for 36 years. His grandfather worked there, his father worked there, his aunt and uncle, everybody in his family worked there. And Randy worked there for 36 years and received a police escort out of the building the day he was let go. And Randy is in effect, the town mayor. They don't have a mayor; they're too small. But he's the sort of the head boss. And so he talked about the history of DeWitt in detail, and he talked about how the Peterson family, when they owned that plant, not only were the Petersons the community in that they built the ball field and that they paid for the uniforms, and they have a 5-bay firehouse because of the Petersons. But when the Petersons made tough business decisions, and they did make tough business decisions over many decades, they knew the people that were being affected by those decisions. They knew their porches and their churches and their names and their kids. And that totally factored into the decision making. When they sold to American Tools and American Tools sold to Newell Rubbermaid, those decisions fall into this issue of distance and disconnect, and that decimates an entire community. I mean, DeWitt doesn't have a grocery store now. They have no amenities now. And the people that are left there are mainly retirees, and everyone else has had to, by and large, scram. And so that's a community gone. Empire, Nevada, they mined gypsum for drywall in the booming Reno housing market. When that dried up, USG closed down the gypsum mine, and the town of Empire closed. I mean, I'm talking a chain link fence around the town, and the zip code is eliminated, and everybody is kicked out. It's gone. So that disconnect has the capacity to obliterate communities on a small scale, never mind what it might do on a national scale.
Okay.
Let me just say one more thing about that, sure. Because I actually think this is a really important point, and one way to think about it. So I want to avoid the critique of the meritocracy offer in the book is I don't want to lapse into nostalgia, right? Because it's a danger if you're critiquing the meritocracy. And there's a conservative literature on critique of meritocracy that is nostalgic. I mean, David Brooks is sort of explicitly kind of pines for the days of some set of sort of self-ordained elect who can make these decisions, right? But there are distinctions between current elites and previous elites, and this distinction is really embodied in the difference between George Romney and Mitt Romney. Right? George Romney lived somewhere. I mean, he was actually from a place which was Michigan. And he lived there basically his whole life. He moved around a little bit. In fact, one of the Romney houses had to be knocked down because it had lay vacant for too long. But he lived there, and he had a company that was in that one place and ran for governor in that one place. Mitt Romney has homes in 5 states. The business he ran is a perfect embodiment of this different kind of deracinated elite, where they would open and shut plants, mostly shut plants, Kansas City, in Texas, in Seattle suburbs, right? And he's not actually from anywhere in any really deep sense. Like, he's in La Jolla, he's in their ski house in Utah, he switches his residency to Utah so he can pay less taxes when he moves to Salt Lake City to improve the games. He switches it back to Massachusetts so that he can run for governor of Massachusetts. So this sense of being tied to a place, which, and this just gets at a broader issue about global capitalism, right? Capital is mobile and labor is not, right? People are rooted to places in a way that dollar figures are simply no longer. And that mismatch is incredibly disruptive in people's lives because we are embodied physical human beings who have things like roots and have kin and have friends and have social networks, all of which stick to the land in some way, even if we're not in a small town of 562. And that creates profound dislocation and friction with the logic of the frictionless movement of capital that is the ideal of the current financial economy.
Yeah. I'd like to ask them two more questions and open it up. One is a general question, and then the other is a more personal question. And quickly, on the topic of nostalgia and merit, I'll overhear these conversations all the time between legacies of Yaleys, the old school Yale from the 50s and the new school Yale of the 2000s, and they'll say, well, which Yale is better now that, it's, back in the day, it was just your merit, and therefore it's a better elite. But now they'll say, no, once we diversified it, and it's more diverse, and now it's more meritocratic. But anyway, all of that, Elijah, is beside your point of the elite becoming corrupt because of the forces you mentioned. So the general question is, when I travel this country, I hear such visceral denigration of poor people, poor white trash, poor people. Why does America hate poor people so much?
They don't want to be poor. Americans don't want to be poor. And I think it has to do with this this idea that you outlined very well in the book, this idea that the meritocracy will work, that we have the opportunity to do this. So everybody likes to think of themselves as doing this and likes to distance themselves from whatever is perceived as poor. And I think it speaks to sort of our sense of identity in terms of what we like to think of as our personal capacity and our national capacity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there's contempt for the taint of loserness. I think there's a sort of celebration of winners and a vision of all this as competition. And I also think that there's a literature about this that literally goes back to the founding of the country about America's distinct conceptions of class and how much it was different than the conceptions of class in Europe, and how much it was complicated both by slavery and the absence of feudalism in a 1,000-year history of a certain kind of feudalism. But our conceptions of class are so relative and fine-grained in the sense that someone who's rich is someone who has more money than you, and someone who's poor is someone who has less money than you. And that category shifts depending on even where you move. So I think people are hesitant to identify. In order to have poverty or the poor be a powerful force in our politics, right, the necessary precondition to interest groups in American politics is identity, right? You can't have an interest group until you have an identity. So you can't have an interest group in American politics of the poor because of people's reluctance, understandably, to identify as poor. You have seen very little explicit organizing around the interest group of the unemployed, because people do not want to identify themselves as the signature thing about them in the public sphere being unemployed. The one exception are the long-term unemployed, the 99ers, who did do this remarkable thing in which they got together online and organized for extended benefits and were kind of coming out and I use the term advisedly, right? Declaring a public identity about themselves so as to provide the necessary precondition for the kind of political organizing that makes these kind of interest group politics possible.
Yeah, and despite the denigration. So let's talk about signatures. You guys, after all, are writers. Let's talk about signatures and identity, since you brought it up. You've mentioned the Bronx 3 times. You're a product of Hunter College High School, which is wringing its hands about the same questions of merit that we're discussing now. So the question to both of you is, how do the markers of your identity and you as human beings, how did it affect your research, what you wrote, and how your books are being received? Because DW, I wonder if you did your research in that snazzy jacket.
I did.
And I wonder if people accuse you of being an elite.
I'm more interested.
I did not wear this jacket when interviewing people. I saved this jacket for tonight and all of you. But it's a very good question, because I knew the fastest way to end, when I could see hesitancy in someone's eyes about whether or not they were going to talk to me, and we're standing outside an unemployment office, in Omaha, I know the second I tell them I'm from New York City, it's all, any chance I have of them engaging is going to go out the window. So I did try to keep attention off of myself and
lied. You're like, I'm from Omaha, dude.
Well, upstate New York, that sounds a lot better. But I really actually stole some tricks from Studs Terkel, who talked about just sort of acting clumsy, and I allowed myself to be clumsy. I allowed myself to be inarticulate, and I allowed myself to make it clear to them how much I wanted to simply know their story. It was about that, getting the person to trust the fact that that was all I wanted, that I wanted to hear their story. It's really hard to get someone to believe that that's all that you're after. And so it was really about trying to get to that point. And it was just crazy persistence. And I'll also say that the experience of talking to so many people changed my perspective on work, and really encouraged me to reconfigure my own life and how I approach work. And something that hasn't really come up here yet because it's not altogether relevant to the key points we're discussing, but something that people that are younger, that are unemployed, tend to face is that it's a corporateless world. It's a freelance world, which fits their interest, they think, but also fits the corporation's interest, because, or whomever's employing them, because they don't have to give them benefits, and they don't have to give them all the auxiliary stuff that MetLife gave their employees 30 years ago when they were called Mother Met. It's a freelancer's world, and I relate to that, and people have a way of running themselves into the ground. They think at first, I have all this freedom, it's fantastic. And then one day they wake up and they work 20 hours a day. I mean, they're working nonstop. And that's a whole different problem about work moving forward and what work looks like for us moving forward. But that's something that came up again and again, and something I related to, and something that's really affected my own personal life and thinking.
Fantastic.
Briefly, to piggyback on that, I'm always struck by the fact that there's this entire literature that exists. Marx talks about this quite a bit, but it's not just a Marxist notion. There's actually a huge literature around what are people going to do when they don't have to work anymore, right? There's this belief that, you know, obviously we produce more with less. Mechanization, the genius of progress. You know, we have people, we're going to have robots doing it all. And if you watch the Jetsons, in the Jetsons, George Jetson works like 6 hours a week or something. And like that was the idea was that like obviously the benefits of progress will be reaped in the form of leisure. Like clearly that's why once we don't have to work, we're not going to go to the factory every day. And in fact, it's been the opposite, right? We're working more hours now, which is kind of an amazing fact about how that economy has ended up. This book is I think there's the subtext of a lot of this book is a slightly tortured wrestling with my own implication in this kind of meritocratic story, because everyone who has some kind of success in the system of meritocracy is almost required as a kind of rite of passage through it to write for themselves a story of how they overcame.
Yeah.
You know, even Mitt Romney did this at a Republican debate where he talked about how he could have inherited the car company, but he walked away from that and he struck out on his own, which was to Harvard Law and Harvard Business School. But I think that's genuinely felt, and I even myself think, well, you know, I'm this kid from the Bronx. My dad was a community organizer. My mom was an educator. You know, my first apartment had no heat, and I got into Hunter High School, and through my pluck and drive, you know, now I'm a TV host. It's the American dream. But of course, you know, that's a pretty ridiculous or selective story. I had just tremendous amount of privilege in just the fact that what my parents gave to me, and deeply loving household I was in, and being a straight white man in America does not hurt, and different contingent breaks and generosity or that people have afforded me at different moments. Testing well, I've come to see as like basically a contingent feature, like being tall, right? Yeah. It's sort of very tangentially related to anything that's actually called intelligence, and it's also not something that you deserve in any deep way. And so, I think that it's a natural inclination to think that the system that is ending up conferring outsized benefits on you clearly knows what it's doing. And part of the project of the book is that for people that are products of this system, and who are not at the bottom of it, but near the top of it, to wake them up around the fact that the system itself is not sustainable or justifiable in the long run. That it's not the final state of things, that we have this social model that we have. And I want the book to provoke people, and I get some interesting emails from people or letters from people that read the book who are right-thinking liberals who went to Hunter and then to Yale, and who are buy the parts of the argument except the ones that apply to them.
Right, of course, yeah. It's almost a form of self-preservation.
And I just want to say one more thought, too, because it ties back to that earlier discussion about disconnect. I feared before I set out on this trip that I would run into situations in red states where there would be some kind of inherent animosity. They would sniff me out in my politics, and I would sniff their politics out, and it would be really hard to talk. But my goodness, that was not the truth at all. When I went to someone's home, when I went to track them down physically and engage them physically in the same space and share a coffee or a beer with them, ideology couldn't have even been a part of it. And it was about that interpersonal exchange, and we engaged each other, as corny as it might sound, as two human beings, and I think that that was important. This, couldn't have happened over the phone or remotely or by some sort of survey. It was about sort of that interpersonal interaction that really closed that prevailing disconnect.
Fantastic. So we have, on good authority from Jessica Strand, if we can go for about 15 minutes for audience questions, and then there'll be books for sale and signing immediately afterward. So do we have any audience questions? Yeah.
How did you find the people?
It was a lot of things I mentioned earlier. It was anything we could think of. And I was traveling with MJ Sieber, a filmmaker, and Mallory Avedon, a playwright. And my wife Tasha came with us when she was able, although she actually had a steady job. And so we essentially slept for like 5 or 6 hours. And then the rest of the time we were either talking to someone or looking for someone. And it was beat reporters at city newspapers were really helpful, especially folks that had covered unemployment in the area and knew about it. We stood outside of unemployment offices. We went to church every Sunday. We were at food banks. We were trying to think of that person from 3rd grade who was from Salt Lake City. It sounds cliche at this point, but it's amazing what you can find on Facebook. I mean, we would read an article about someone, factory closing, someone's quoted in the article, and we could get to them in 30 seconds through Facebook. It was just thinking about every possible way to find people. And there was an awesome sort of organic sneaking trail of people, one leading to another. A casino manager in Reno says, "Oh, I know a guy who lost a job and he moved out, east. You should look him up when you get to Pittsburgh." And that was kind of nice too, because it really felt more intimate. That string felt more intimate.
Fantastic. Okay, yes, sir.
In the book about elites, I wonder if your research, you covered any of the recent or emergent psychological material about personality disorders, psychopathy, some of the scholarship I've read uses, for example, you talk about how can the teachers' unions be the blame of this, right? Sort of paralogic and all these sorts of things that we don't necessarily understand are evidently linked to these leadership people, and also drawing people from working class through the elite schools, and then they become hatchet men. And it's systematic, and you can read about it throughout history.
So there's amazing social psychological research on this topic. and I draw on some of the book. One of the so there's a bunch of different findings increasingly. There's a literature in which a set of experiments are done broadly similar that find different things. And one of the basic premises of these experiments is they bring people in, they prime them through different ways to be high status or low status, high power, low power. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do this priming. Some of it's this: you send someone in and you say something as explicit as, you're going to play a game in which you have to listen to that person and tell the other person you're going to play a game, and you give all these commands. And then when they're done, you then give them the test. There's all sorts of other ways of priming. But the idea is that you prime people to be high power, low power, and then you have them do all sorts of different tasks. And then what you find are that people reason in very different ways under conditions of being high power and low power. People under high power conditions are much more abstract in their thinking. They're much more theoretical as opposed to particular and detailed. They have much bigger appetites for risk. This is a very reliable finding in the literature, that people of high power and high status have much bigger appetites for risk than people of low power and low status. They are much less empathetic. They notice things a lot less. And this makes a certain amount of sense. People whose livelihoods depend on not pissing off their boss are going to become incredibly attuned to the boss's facial expressions and emotional registers in a way that, the Earl of Abbey, Downton Abbey, is not going to be attuned to the mood of the butler, right? My favorite example of this, my favorite finding in the social psychological research, is when you prime people high power, low power, and you tell them you say, write the letter L on your forehead. People who are primed high power write the letter L so that they can read it, and people who are primed for low power write the letter L mirror so that others can read it. Right? So there is actually a social psychological thing happening in which high status and low status, high power and low power, change the perspective and point of view. Being at the bottom makes you more inclined to see yourself from the outside, whereas being at the top makes you less inclined to see yourself from the outside and to write the letter L in a way that no one else can read it but you can.
That's why I don't release my tax reform. You don't need to see them. Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about education, their role in creating inequality, unions, creating equality for kids in areas of New York and whatnot. I want you to expand a little bit on that, and then what do you think education's role is in kind of solving this phenomenon, or helping to close the gap between the 99%? Yeah.
So the question is, what's the role of education in closing the gap, and its role in inequality? So I guess that what I would say is that there's two conversations to be had, and I feel like we only have one. Right? So there's a conversation about school quality, which I think is basically, how do you produce good schools? Now, one of the things that happens in the American conversation about education is that we say American schools are terrible. But it's just not true that American schools are terrible. American schools in poor neighborhoods are bad. American schools in wealthy areas are quite good. And American schools in the broad middle are okay. Which is not perhaps that shocking, but that's basically what the data shows, and it's what parents self-report. If you ask people, do you like your local public school, right? The approval tracks very closely with the Census Bureau data of the folks that are in those schools. So when you start to say, okay, let's narrow in the question and let's forget about, Scarsdale High School, and let's forget about schools in very wealthy neighborhoods. Poor schools. My feeling is that there's two conversations to be had about poor kids. One is about schooling, and one is about effectiveness. And I think I supported the CTU strike. I'm a big supporter of teachers' unions. I think they generally have their interests aligned with students much more than the current dogma says. Certainly more than the random ass hedge funders who are funding their demise. But that said, I also think the debate on quality is a really interesting one, and I think we should be open-minded about what empirical studies show about different things. I think there's a kind of obsession with testing that I think is bad for a whole bunch of reasons. I think the statistical details on assessing teacher quality are a million times more fraught and complicated than people are willing to recognize. That if you actually start digging into it, you find that it has extremely low predictive power, the models they use to assess teacher quality. But now I'm really off in the weeds here, I'm sorry. But let me get back to the broader point, which is I would be less frustrated with that conversation if it was happening in parallel with a conversation of why do we have so many poor kids? We should have less poor kids. How can we make them less poor? We can redistribute money. We can literally just write their parents checks. We can have a guaranteed minimum income in this country. Richard Nixon proposed one. People have this debate, oh, Mitt Romney is smearing Barack Obama about getting rid of the work requirement in welfare. We should get rid of the work requirement in welfare. we should make sure that people aren't poor. Now I know this is completely outside of the boundaries of the current political debate.
Yeah.
But even if you don't believe in that, if you think that's really ineffective, if you think it's been shown that that leads to all sorts of perverse incentive, fine. You like the earned income tax credit, you like all that stuff, let's talk about that. But let's have a national conversation that is equal in volume, vigor, and focus to the one we're having about education quality about poor kids. And we just simply don't. There is no way in which we do. So I feel that what ends up happening is education gets used in this very pernicious way as a way of avoiding that conversation. Because the idea is if we can just get this thing right, if we can just get the schooling in these poor neighborhoods right, then the system itself is redeemed entirely. Because then we'll achieve this thing called equality of opportunity, and then all the results of the outcomes will then be justified. And so I think it becomes this there's a kind of reverse engineering around a preordained ideological vision for making the model work that drives the emphasis back on education. And I think there are really important conversations to be had about education, and I want to remain open-minded and not be a kind of like doctrinaire liberal about don't stop saying mean things about the teachers' unions, right? Like, we should look at what the data says about increasing the efficacy of our schools. But we should also talk about why do we have so many poor kids. And one more thing I'll say, and then I'm sorry that I'm ranting on this, but obviously this is something. It is literally the explicit, although not often articulated, but it is literally the vision of American education reform right now that we will have separate but equal schools. That is the vision of America. We all basically say, obviously, it will be the case that New York City public schools will be 90% non-white, obviously. Or Chicago, 92% not white. That's just the way it's going to be. But let's make them equal. That is the vision for education in this country, is achieving schools that are separate but equal.
And liberals are implicated in this because they're sending their kids to the private school, and they're really invested in that vision of America.
I just got very ranty. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's what. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah, this is a question for Chris about empathy versus self-interest, and what do you think about empathy and self-interest in a heterogeneous society like America?
It's hard, and I think it's that empathy and self-interest in a heterogeneous society. I'm going to say something very quick, and then I want you to talk about this, because I think that one of the things that's so fascinating in here is the empathy people feel for the people that had to fire them, and also the fact that, and the way that empathy diffused what way they might pursue their interest as a group. But I think it's very hard, and people point to this all the time, and there's interesting sociological studies on this, right, that redistribution, empathy as a sort of, as an affective sensation people have is very much constrained by how much the person who is the target of the empathy looks like them. As a historical, political fact, redistribution is harder in heterogeneous societies than in homogeneous societies. I think, obviously, because of the former. And I look forward to the future of, after years of intermarriage, when we just have this big mestizo America where we can finally get the social democracy we deserve.
We'll see.
Well, I think that people are catching. The thing about Randy Badman and DeWitt is that he made it very clear that he did not blame the workers in China who ostensibly took his job. He said those people are going to, I'm sure they're working for whatever they're working for now, but they're going to want better lives. They're going to want cars and better amenities in their home and for their children. He recognized that he was in a boat with them. And I think that was important. And this another gentleman who comes to mind, Jim Drywaller, in Nevada, who not a liberal, doesn't like Obama, and he talked about Mexicans coming to do construction work, and all of these Mexicans coming here, and it was funny because I kept waiting for him to go on some kind of scary tirade, but he didn't. He said. They drove down the cost that we got per hour, but it wasn't their fault. It was the people that were hiring them. And now they're not even here now anymore. They had to go back. And the ones that are here are in the same position I'm in. It was encouraging to me to see American workers realize that it's not us and them, and that laborers are laborers, and people who work are people who work no matter where you are.
Okay, final question. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment on empathy. So the people who are striving for them to know when enough is enough, so that they can share. When is enough enough?
Yeah, so the question is the striving and when is enough enough. And I talk about this in the book, that one of the perverse consequences of what I call in the book fractal inequality in America, which is, inequality that kind of reinscribes itself in every level of analysis, right? So if you take the income distribution, right, it looks like this, okay? If you just take the 1%, it looks like this, right? The top 100th of 1% is doing way better than the bottom of the 1%. And if you zoom in on the top 100th of the 1% and do the same thing, you see the same kind of distribution. And what that means is that you are always going to be around people that have more than you, because there is no top to the ladder. It's like an M.C. Escher drawing in which it just kind of recedes up, or you keep going up the stairs, and that I think produces some really nasty psychological consequences, because it makes it impossible to say enough, right? People, and this is really, you see this in New York. I mean, if you're making, people are making a lot of money in New York, and they certainly don't feel rich because it's an expensive city, and because they're in a peer group where they are bidding for the services of people against those other people. So the other people that make as much money as them are also bidding for the house they want to buy. So the house is very expensive, and for the schooling they want to get for their kids, and the healthcare, which is basically the 3 pillars of middle-class life. And so if you have this kind of bidding war constantly along the lines of your socioeducational group, no one's benefiting.
One of the most devastating critiques in the book, Chris's book, is he talks about helicopter envy while he's sitting in a bar in Davos. Not his helicopter envy, but those who didn't get to go to Davos in a helicopter having landed in Zurich. But we see that here in New York with bidding wars with private schools. We see that with housing. We see that on and on. Jobs. This idea that, as this lady is suggesting, enough is never enough. Okay, one last question, sir, do you want to ask, and then we'll go?
Yeah.
Okay, finally.
Just like you were saying with the coordinates and everything, I know you went on a rant. I think it's become so socially acceptable in America to be poor and everything. We don't look down, but it's just accepted. And then, sort of more about that, but also about how America, this land that we all live in, freedom, and we praise it, and like it's the best country to live in. But right now we're dealing with voter ID fraud, and it's just so shocking to me that we're like raising kids up in our country, and that's going on.
Those two things are related, and I'll quickly try to tie them together. The political analysis underlying the now infamous 47% comment by Mitt Romney is a political analysis that worries about democracy used as a tool of redistribution and dispossession by the dispossessed. right? The fear is that there's more poor people than rich people, so if all the poor people vote, they're going to vote for benefits out of the pockets of the rich people. This is something that such noteworthy James Madison worried about. In fact, the Constitution is designed, reverse engineered around achieving the result in which that won't happen. And so there is a fear, particularly on the right now, because I think there's an awareness of the amount of economic misery is going to produce some political backlash. And I actually think the efforts of voter suppression through voter ID laws is partly driven about this what happens if this great mass of dispossessed people are spurred to vote by their economic misery? What will that mean for people at the top?
Well, I want to thank you guys. I want to thank the audience for
Thanks,
coming
guys.
to hear
Thank you.
about these books. Great.